Yeah, just start, yeah.
Or hi, and welcome to the fourth session of Qwernomics and Semiotic Fatality with Nick Land, and I'm going to pass the mic off to him now.
Okay, thanks, Theodore. So among the few things that I think have been clearly signposted is I'm hoping that we're going to, at least one of the things we'll be talking about today, and I am assuming further, is this extremely enigmatic essay or chapter of 1,000 Plateaus called The Geology of Morals. It obviously has a three-part title, actually, and all three parts of it are it's got a date, as all the plateaus or chapters of 1,000 Plateaus have, 10,000 BC. Now, this is one of the things I've been racking my brains on this week, as many times before, and I honestly have to just start off saying I have no idea what that date is doing there. So, I mean, that's, I guess, the first of probably many digressions. I'm not hugely optimistic about a neat solution to that, but that would be obviously fantastic. Maybe the main part of the title, the geology of morals, is the least superficially confusing part of it. It's obviously a play off Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, and the role of geology in this section is something we'll see. But again, to start with the most kind of superficial type of approach to it, and I'm going to, I'll give a quote that I think I'll come back to because it's so interesting and I want to. They say, double articulation is so extremely varied that we cannot begin with a general model, only a relatively simple case. Now, I think there's a lot going on in this sentence, but to take it very straightforwardly, the relatively simple case, from the way the text then flows, seems to be using geology as the first instance of stratification. And obviously the word stratification is drawn primarily from a geological discourse. Who does the Earth think it is? I've got a little answer to that, but I'm just going to pause on that. So as a structural point, this course, this whole chapter is full of these doublings and two-sided and differences. Has a lot to do, but is no maybe sort of superficially on pages hang on, 72 to 3, I think, yes, where the challenger, who is supposedly giving a lecture now to an empty lecture hall, runs very fast through what has already been said. And crucial to this is the fact that I'm in danger of getting things out of order here, but the abstract machine on the side of what he calls the plane of consistency of the body of that organ, and the machinic assemblage that actually runs and operates the strata that produces stratification is a two-sided I can't say phenomenon, entity, maybe I can get away with. And I'm hoping that we can run the the split between our two modules exactly down that split between these two faces. And so one of the things that I hope to do today is to set up the sort of relevance of this text to people's at least tentative satisfaction, and then go into some of the stranger consequences of dealing with it in this context in the to come. So the difficulties of this piece of writing, one very prominent one, is it a philosophical essay or a story? Given the sort of the predominant statistical character of the text, it's easier to mentally categorize it as a philosophical essay. Most of the sentences seem to be of a theoretical type, but it's obviously framed within this peculiar story about a lecture presented by Professor Challenger, a fictional character who is himself, and I put that in inverted commas because they themselves put a question mark over his gender identity among many other identities. It's clearly extremely cryptic and mutable character who begins at the start of I'll call it an essay. It seems to be a recognizable pedagogical figure, and by the end of it, he's referencing Lovecraft's Through the Gate of the Silver Key, has completely lost identifiable characteristics. Maybe I should read that now, actually, because it's good. This is their quote from the Lovecraft text, where they say, in fact, I'll go a little bit back before that because it's really nice. They say, Challenger, or what remained of him, slowly hurried towards the plane of consistency, following a bizarre trajectory with nothing relative left about it. He tried to slip into an assemblage serving as a drum gate, the particle clock, with its intensive clicking and conjugated rhythms hammering out the absolute quote. The figure slumped oddly into a posture scarcely human and began a curious, fascinated sort of shuffle towards the coffin-shaped clock. The figure had now reached the abnormal clock, and the watcher saw through the dense fumes a blurred black claw fumbling with the tall hieroglyph door. The fumbling made a queer clicking sound. Then the figure entered the coffin-shaped case and pulled the door shut after it. The abnormal clicking went on, beating out the dark, cosmic rhythm which underlies all mystical gate openings. And they say the mechanosphere or rhizosphere. So obviously there's a framing of this strange piece of writing as something piece of chthonic yoga, or perhaps even worse. There's the constant menace of tilting over into that. So I'm going to struggle, at least at this stage, to try to constantly keep things as restrained to confident steps as it's possible to be, because these strange lines of speculation are constantly provoked by it. So I think when answer my own little point earlier, when the section of the book says, who does the earth think it is? One partial answer to that surely is Professor Challenger. That Professor Challenger is actually the avatar corresponding that question. Okay, I think that the order to proceed is this. These complications aside, which are obviously significant, I think there's a question, an inescapable question: why is strata analysis so difficult? Let me again just quote a little bit from this book. They say, in fact, Professor Chandra was double articulated twice, and that did not make things any easier. People never knew which of him was present. He claimed to have invented a discipline he referred to by various names: rhizomatic, strata analysis, schizoanalysis, nomodology, micropolitics, pragmatics, the science of multiplicities. Yet no one clearly understood methods or principles of this discipline were. And I think there's two ways to just depart from that immediately. Yes, but I think it just needs to be said anyway, is that obviously at the saddest level of interpretation, it just sounds as if they're saying Professor Chandra is the two of them, Deleuze and Guattari. It's like there's these little sort of not subtle, blatant hints that at least stabilize that interpretation. It's obviously like it is the kind of the saddest and least intriguing way to go with that, but it's a way of just giving people something to hang on to momentarily. See this list of disciplines that they outline reinforces that. They say nobody clearly understood what the goals, method, or principles of this discipline were. They're just being annoying. They're just saying, they're just being arbitrarily obscurantist about it. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's important to ask the question, why is strata analysis so difficult? And I think we can come to a sort of stage we can get to with that question that is to everything that we then do with it. Among the answers to this, and we've already seen one aspect of it in this question about the extreme generality of double articulation, their quasi stratification. But we can also ask, I think, what could we mean of the strata? Challenger is in some respects a way of problematizing the transcendent theoretical subject. There's this weird avatar, this fictional element. It's an interrupts and interferes with the notion that we have some familiar notion of theoretical communication taking place here. And I think that that's really important and integral to what they're doing. Because between the model and its object, there is a relationship of stratification. There's an obvious, really uncontrollable reflexivity that immediately bursts into this. As soon as we think that we could simply just produce a model of stratification of a kind that we're familiar with, a theory of stratification, a philosophy of stratification, we've already implicitly admitted what stratification is as a topic. Because what stratification is as a topic is that which will grasp understanding, will grasp the process by which a model and an object are put in relationship with each other. It will. Sorry, I've confused myself with my own syntax here. But stratification envelops that relationship. It's not something that can be conceived as an object on one side of the relationship, and it's extremely important doing that. They don't allow, for the sake of convenience, this issue to be set aside or shelves, I guess, as strata 2. What stratification is about, what their model of stratification is about, is the subsumption of structure issue. Stratification, there is a strata. The strata are a product. And so the relationship, the model and its object, in order to be posed at the level of transcendental philosophy, to be conceived as itself being the product of a machine of stratification. The machine of stratification eludes of the object within a theoretical discourse. Now, I think I already hinted last week about one of the ways that we could go with this, and maybe even compelled to ultimately go about it. And I certainly think weeks will kind of be on this path. In our particular case, which is dealing with QWERTY, that we lose the presumption of a space of theoretical reflection outside of the object considered, with our own relatively simple case of the extremely varied phenomenon of which is Qwernomics. Doing that seriously, and if we're doing it at the level of the transcendental, then we can't simply situate our topic in the position of an object among other possible objects that could be of theoretical attention. That cannot be the relation. And as soon as you say that isn't the relation, then obviously you get into the kind of complexities that, just as philosophy, leaving aside other issues, this essay so when they're talking then about trying to find an extremely abstract general vocabulary for discussing the strata in all their vast variation, from physicochemical strata right through to what they call the alloplastic strata of technology and social structures. We could get into a huge discussion. I think partly is inescapable, but I don't think I'm going to try and run through that now because it would hog too much time. I think we should engage that in a more dialogical mode about what that apparatus is that they're presenting us with. There's a few things that that maybe can be said. They want to say that there are three major stratic systems, at least in this book. They have this triadic system. There's basically one that is physico-chemical geological, there's one that is biological, and there is one, to repeat this term, that is alloplastic. And various phenomena can therefore be situated at in these major stratic clusters. And all of them, Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do, or I don't know whether I should say Professor Challenger is trying to do in this text, is find a conceptual vocabulary that is adequate to all of these three levels, that captures stratification at its most extreme generality. And I think the most consistent, there's a huge amount of vocabulary in this essay that we can pick at in pieces, but I think it's reasonable to say that the most consistent and insistent element of it is this distinction they make between content and expression. And for them, content and expression is equivalent to double articulation. Double articulation is, in a sense, shorthand for articulation of content and articulation of expression. So when they show you, as the picture at the front of the essay, this lobster with its two twin pincers, its two claws that capture intensities always in two different ways with two different articulations. Those two different articulations are articulation by content and articulation by expression. And in introducing this language, they're wanting to break with what I think elsewhere they call the hylomorphic model that opposes forms and substances. So double articulation means both the side of content and the side of expression, there are formed substances, forms and substances of content, forms and substances of expression. From someone coming out of, I think, the main European philosophical tradition, the huge clue here is this quadratic structure, because it's, I think, I'm sort of hugely open to controversy on this point, but I think that this is describing a diagonalization matrix, which we've been to before at various times. The absolute classic example, obviously, Kant's analytic synthetic a priori a posteriori distinctions, producing a kind of a quadratic table, is, to use their language, isomorphic with the apparatus they're putting together with this content and expression distinction. And they're completely explicit about the fact that this, for them, is designed to draw a diagonal line. So they have these intermittent invocations, really, of the earth, of absolute deterritorialization, of matter as unformed, or rather I should say unformed matter, which has not been stratified into forms and substances by, or a distinction of content and expression, de-stratified. That is the diagonal line. It's the zone of intensities, and intensities, the notion of intensities is itself a diagonal construction, as I think, again, I'm being repetitive, but maybe it's worth being repetitive. The intensities as quantities is a is an intrinsically diagonal concept. That again, the stratic, the way in which intensities are broken up is through a system of differentiation of the heterogeneous and the homogeneous, the quantitative and the qualitative, that segments and breaks the intrinsic diagonal of a heterogeneous quantity of an intensity. So they talk about this in from lots of different angles, but they're all completely consistent. That what strata as machines do is they seize intensities, they stratify it, they articulate it always twice in terms of content and expression. The relationship between content and expression is the stratic relationship. And between content and expression, there is a diagonal line that links to the abstract machine on the body without organs. That is, I think we can say with utter confidence that this is the line that Professor Challenger takes throughout the course of the essay. So as a story, it's the story of Professor Challenger's stationary voyage on the diagonal line to absolute deterritorialization, or the body without organs, the earth as unformed matter, which is, in a sense, I could say, no doubt highly problematically, but is consummated in that little passage already read from the end of the essay. But I'm not going to say much more about the structure of this theoretical machinery now. I hope that this can be part of our topic conversation. I'm just going to say a few things about why we're talking about it in this course. And very preliminarily, I've again tried to do a kind of to break this down into a threefold structure, but I really think that just emerged spontaneously from there. So first of all, there's the application of this text can simply take the form of a twisted reading, a reading from behind, in Deleuze's sense, of this sentence. Double articulations are extremely varied, that we cannot begin with a general model, only a relatively simple case, in which we take Qwernomics as our relatively simple case, perhaps with the shadow suggestion that this is not entirely original on our part, but that should be possibly postponed initially. And so what we are doing in this case is taking the discussion of Qwernomics from the papers that we've been looking at in the previous weeks, and seeing what is already being discussed in those papers, the socio-technological process of QWERTY-economics or Qwernomics as a case of stratification, or to use a word that is ambivalent across both the essays we've seen and this one, capture. That the process of capture that is involved, the process of capture that is instantiated and consolidated within QWERTY, that is a process of stratification. And that Qwernomics as it exists in this literature is a particular case given of a process of stratification. So we then subjected to the same kind of analytical approach that Deleuze and Guattari do in this text. We try to be specific about how that mean is operating and how it produces a relative invariance, a stable system that is the QWERTY object in which it is a particular, the keyboard as a particular formed substance, according to some kind of a larger machinery that preserves its regularity, its stable relations, it's what they call its unity of composition. So that's, I think, the most schizophrenic level of approach of this. The next stage, which I think tilts us across into next week, is to take Qwernomics as a stratoanalytical diagram. So in this case, it's not just that the production of the QWERTY system is itself an instance of stratification, but that QWERTY is actually the transcendental resource through which the stratoanalytical theory is able to proceed. And the third level, and actually in some ways I think this is maybe a little bit, it's something that can be held onto perhaps a little bit more firmly in some respect, is the relationship between the alphabet and QWERTY understood to the conceptual resources that this essay produces, where when they're comparing the earth, the absolute deterritorialized, unformed matter with the strata for them is a system that is defined by, I'm kind of quoting them maybe with this at this point, relative deterritorializations and complementary reterritorializations. Now this vocabulary I know is rebarbative to people who've not been immersed in it. So I think I fully understand that it will take some time to feel even remotely, I'm not saying we should get comfortable with it, but a certain sense of adeptness would be helpful. But I think that the case of the alphabet and QWERTY is actually an extremely productive and helpful illustration of what this vocabulary means. Like, it's something actually to hang on to. But obviously, you have in the alphabetical sequence, you have your series of letters all neatly in place. And in the course of the passage into QWERTY, their order, their positions are scrambled. But they're scrambled not through passage to some absolute deterritorialization. It's only a relative deterritorialization. They're moved out of place. But there is a complementary reterritorialization, which is the QWERTY system, in which they are all resettled. So the whole language of movement that you get throughout this essay, and which is referring us always to the machine and to the fact that structures involved always have to be produced by machine. This movement is, in one sense, can be captured by understanding the alphabet and the QWERTY sequence as involving some kind of stratic convulsion, a set of deterritorializations, complementary reterritorializations that take you from one arrangement to and another arrangement, and that it's only between these two that we will find a code for or resources at the level of code that open up our diagonal line, that will lie between the two, that will lie between these, within this convulsion, and between between these two orders and these two settlements of signs. Just really quickly, there's one other thing that I wanted to say a little bit about, which was going back to this question of fiction. And it sort of seemed natural to sort of take that as a clue to just briefly look at this essay of theirs called, sorry, 1 second. I've just lost my, yes, it's their eighth plateau, three novellas, or what happened. And in that piece, they make a distinction between the tale, and it's all, as you know, as one expects reading them, it's complicated. But to put a very crude gloss on it, in a certain sense, it's prospective. It's taking forward, and the question that they think it is promoting is, what is going to happen? What happens next? How will this end up? Whereas the novella, they say, the question posed by the novella is, what has happened? What could have happened? And I think this is a really extremely suggestive Qwernomic question. I think a lot of it's one way of framing a lot of the stuff that I hope we're going to be doing in the subsequent weeks. That when you look at the QWERTY arrangement, maybe primarily in its just core, just as a sort of resequencing of the alphabet, as if it were a novella, as if you're seeing this distribution and you're asking exactly this question: what could have happened? What is it? What was the event that we're missing that took us from the alphabetical sequence arrangement? You know, what is this actual story in this distribution in terms of some occulted that leaves as evidence this of the keys. But I think that that's something that is sensibly kind of kicked. So I think I'm gonna back out of monologue mode now, and see what I'll look at the sidebar and I'll see what to say or talk about.
So, is it then correct to kind of say that we can understand the QWERTY keyboard as both, like the stuff that we've been looking at, it's the kind of temporary outcome of a like socio-historical, technical, diachronic process of stratification in which you end up with this, but it's also a kind of diagram for, like, it's the diagram for the process itself as well.
Yes, I think
right?
The second question, which I'm totally committed to, or the second question, is much more weird and problematic. So I think that the first articulation is, I think, really sound. You know, I think that it can be defended very easily in that QWERTY is a complex kind of object. You know, this I think has haunted this module. What exactly are you talking about as an object when you talk about QWERTY? And I think that to say that what we're seeing, that what this whole comics debate is about, is a process of stratification. That, to use again, there's slightly weird language that they sort of use right at the start of this discussion, where they say, first of all, they talk about the Earth, the deterritorialized, the glacial, the giant molecule, it's a body without organs, etc. But they say that, however, was not the question at hand. And now we're into the primary topic of this section. For there simultaneously occurs upon the other very important inevitable phenomenon that is beneficial in many respects and unfortunate in many others: stratification. You know, beneficial in many respects and unfortunate in many others is actually a docking point for this QWERTY economics discussion. You know, we've seen in the start, it's the emphasis is all on how unfortunate it is. You know, we lost the Dvorak keyboard. We've been locked out from it. It's all very unfortunate. And on the other side, there's all the things that can be said about the advantages that come from network effects, the economies of scale that come from it, that obviously have actually locked it in, that at each stage in a set of sort of, again, to go into the language, micro-political decisions, that do you actually invest, perhaps largely in the hegemony of QWERTY. Implicit in that are this whole series of advantages, that you don't have to retrain, that you can draw on a pool of typists that will all understand the culture of the thing, that your system is being nurtured. So there's been a process of stratification that has kind of settled on in the same kind of way that geological strata settle on a certain kind of rock. You can say it's unfortunate from the perspective of a certain perhaps fantastic perspective of absolute deterritorialization. These particles are locked into these structures. You know, it's a form of capture. It's a type of intensive confinement. But on the other hand, there's a constructive process that can be kind of practically by this set of arrangements. And I think it's the same with QWERTY. It's a certain machinic solution, beneficial in some respects and disadvantageous.
I had a couple of goes at trying to think through like the sort of concrete process of how of the stratification of the keyboard as a like a diachronic process.
Right.
I'll paste them into the sidebar. I think they're both completely insufficient, but they were kind of useful with just getting a hold on the system as it's outlined in that chapter. But I don't know if this is going to be like more annoying and confusing or not, but
no, it's good to have it there. It looks like the sort of thing that might take some yes. This is anyway, I think this is exactly what I was assuming is the type of discussion we're going to have. It's about how we can do this mapping into it.
Yeah, like the first one is kind of, I guess, slightly more zoomed out. So I was trying to think about what would constitute the substance of content and then the form of content in the first articulation.
Right.
So first of all, in the first one, it was the substance of content is the selection of signs that will be used, so the alphabet and the numbers and arrow keys and things, whatever. Then the form of content is the statistical ordering, so the QWERTY layout itself. And then you have the kind of like possible escape route to the plane of consistency in between the two articulations, and that's where you get the possibility of Dvorak or other kind of organizations. Then you have the second articulation with the form of expression, which is the consolidation of it via like, you know, kind of economic means as QWERTY as a standard. And then you get the substance of expression, which is its kind of socio-technical effects on its users. And then in the second one, I was kind of trying to zoom in a little bit more, and it was so again, the statistical selection of the alphabet. The fact then that you had some kind of design limitation. So the form of content is the fact that you have a kind of two-dimensional grid, a particular space that you can use to arrange this set of signs. The form of expression is the constraints that are placed on it by not having, I forget what they're called, digraphs, like words that will use two particular letters typed together in quick succession because of the jamming problem.
Digraphs, aren't they?
Digraphs, yeah. So SH and CH and stuff. And then the substance of expression is the QWERTY layout. And then you have like another strata on top of that, which then kind of goes off into the effects of that in terms of culture. But I don't know if that's like going to be helpful at all, but it was sort of interesting to think of, try and think it through very
obviously
like
it's
that.
the whole thing is kind of maddening, isn't it? I can sort of I can see that. I can see that in there. It's very reminiscent. I mean, and if they're constantly breaking up, you know, like every stratum is already internally stratified. There's this constant process of proliferation and internal splitting, and then relations to epistrata and parastrata, and so kind of neatness is always sort of frustrated by these. I think it would be really good to try and talk about this. Let me just throw another one on, and I'll see how compatible it is with this. It would take some thinking about it. Examples of content expression they obviously use is the perceptions and actions, or they have the face language in the alloplastic face language system and the hand tool section. So they align those with content and expression explicitly by saying the hand tool is on the content side and the face language stratum is on the side. So you've got in the alloplastic stratum, you have this kind of this linguistic, technological, stratic system. So obviously neither is reducible to the other. They both related to a machine of stratification reciprocally. So I think the key on the keyboard is a really useful unit of analysis, because the key is obviously, it seems sort of superficially to have two faces, doesn't it? It's a tool in the sense that you kind of press on the key to produce an action, and it's a statement in the fact that it has both code and territory. It has a position and it has a symbol, is kind of expressive. And so the key puts you into this whole zone of zoo semiotics that they talk about, icons of territoriality that you get in animals. your activity is related to a system of perception by this icon of territoriality. So I think one of the ways that this content, that the keyboard is stratified as a content expression system, is that the forms and substances of expression, which I think is the codes and positions of the keys, as perceived within this, on this linguistic level of expression, are in a relationship of, as they say, non-correspondence and non-conformity, but isomorphism with reciprocal presupposition, with a content of the key that when you depress that key, you get producing a certain an act of production. It will produce a character depending on how the keyboard itself is being obviously deterritorialized from an electric typewriter into a computer interface, offers a process of deterritorialization. So what is the content produced? It's not constant. But I think that those two of the key are pointing us into these two different sides of the strata. Now, if I then say to myself, well, so how does this correspond? No, that correspond is a terrible word. How do I then integrate that with what you said there? I have to reflect.
I was kind of taking the model that I used there from the description of physiochemical processes. So I hadn't quite like advanced into the space of thinking it under the alloplastic category. But I don't know also like how, I mean, these categories interact and everything gets like exponentially more confusing. Yes, but I don't know if it's more useful to try and analyze it on.
It's because of this statement again. So if I can just repeat it for the third time, about when they say double articulation is so extremely varied that we cannot begin with a general model only. So all of these, the particular strata are cases, aren't they? Like, you know, the physicochemical strata, the biological strata, the alloplastic strata. And if we then try to apply them to the keyboard or to QWERTY, I shouldn't say the keyboard. That to me is that's probably a mistake. to whatever QWERTY is as a stratum, then we can expect it's going to work because of the fact that we're dealing with a set of strata. So there's going to, because what's
Nick, can you hear us? Let's just wait a second. You might come back. Hi, Nick. Can you hear us?
Sorry, I just got zapped by a breakdown.
No problem.
I'll take that as a sign that I should stop babbling for a minute. Hang on, but I think I might have lost all the sidebar, which is like a bit catastrophic, because
I can repost it.
whether I can get it back without you having to do that. So does it? Maybe I should say, does anyone else have any immediate responses to Amy's model of application of the conceptual machinery of strata analysis onto QWERTY-nomics as an object? I shouldn't say object. I should say special case.
So I was just sort of thinking about earlier, I finally got, well, once we sort of realized that it was the peristrata rather than the epistrata, I kind of finally clicked with seeing the numeric keypad as a peristratum, and I was reading that section of the Geology of Morals, and they really focus on, I believe, the peristratum as processual, and then the epistratum as motion-based. And so this is maybe like, okay, it'll loop back around to kind of being about the substratum question at the top of your notes, Amy, but just like to start with, I do have that right? Like movement versus process. Shit, I've lost it in where I was in Geology of Morals. But just, yeah, no, it's the other way around. It's epistratum or process and peristratum. It doesn't matter. But just in terms of mapping these movements across the keys, like the distribution of QWERTY as opposed to the order of the alphabet being a distribution of movements. And you see that with like your CHSH example, where a certain movement of the mouth, because of like aspiration basically, becomes 2 letters, and that maps to particular movements of hands, which is what interfaces it with the QWERTY distribution. And then this is where it kind of comes back up to the substratum question of the digital numerical system. Is like, I was reading the history of the Universal History of Numbers book a couple of days ago, and somehow it never really hit me that the reason that we learn A through Z, like the quote unquote order of the alphabet, ultimately is because we counted with it. Like that was like most of the alphabetic cultures, which I didn't realize, used like a purely like an alphabetic counting system, and not so much like the Roman tallying system that or advanced tallying system. And so that's the whole reason that we have that order A through Z in the first place. And so that mapping of that particular kind of counting to a movement-based sort of second kind of ordering, 2-dimensional ordering, QWERTY, which is itself sort of like undergoes these selection effects from a third stratum of movement. I don't know, I was trying to sort of map that onto the peristratum, epistratum, substratum distinction, like as it applies to QWERTY, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I think it intersects a lot with what Wanyon's also saying in the sidebar, isn't it? About obviously there's this complicated process of deterritorialization and reterritorialization going on just in typing as a process. So I mean the typist. The fingers of the typist are obviously reterritorialized on the keyboard, and there's a deterritorialization of language into the keyboard that I guess has the, if we're using their language, complementary reterritorialization, then is this reterritorialization of the hands on the keyboard. So that there's QWERTY as a system of stratification is obviously this stratic. Because I don't want to suggest that it's necessarily completely captured by the alloplastic stratum. I may be captured here, but thinking of it as something that is happening to the human organism, you can obviously see how there is this capture of a system of behavior, a freeing of language and a capture of behavior in this kind of complementary stratic arrangement that happens with typing in general. And QWERTY is obviously the specific order of that stratum, isn't it? Yes, like I think all of this, so when you say feedback loop, all of this is a particular re-articulation of cybernetics. I think that it's understanding stratification just is cybernetics. Stratification, if it's understood in the weird way that they do it, of the fact that there is always the earth, there's always absolute deterritorialization, there's always the line of flight in the strata. So stratification isn't the annulling or neutralization or suppression of deterritorialization. It's always imminent deterritorialization. But with that caveat, it's actually a kind of re-articulation of cybernetic theory as a process of capture of intensities.
Yeah, because I mean and it's interesting, it's just for any pair of keys, like any on the board, any vector, a key being repeated, one to itself, each one of those is a feedback loop and is explicitly based on a feedback loop, right? Like that position on the sort of orthodox QWERTY board was generated by this feedback loop across all of the uses of language of when you use these two letters together, like literally like operant conditioning of combining these letters. And then that in turn trains our hands through operant conditioning, which is another, like a very basic cybernetic feedback loop, to make those movements, to make them faster or slower if it's you have to type G, K, T for some reason, German, I guess, yeah. Which is kind of brings in that issue of English being the base language of it as well, or the origin language.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. You mean that the QWERTY arrangement is peculiarly conditioned by having coming out of a lineage of English in particular?
Right. I think like in terms of the operant conditioning effects that flow through from language to keyboard to sort of motion encoding of language, that there has to be insofar as the user population is much larger than English itself, occurs like pretty much cross languages, Indian and the pictographic cases like that. Like there's no other conclusion that there is like a flow of transformation that finds its first instance or its last instance, depending on whether you look at it, in like specifically English and not non-English cybernetics. I don't know if the cybernetics it's a fine-grained question whether the cybernetics themselves are in some sense like an Anglo-cybernetics linguistically, or whether they are like sort of remapped and rendered chaotic entirely, even if they have as an initial determination these relationships between sounds and letters in English. Sorry, I'm just like meandering here.
Digressing.
Yeah, digressing, exactly. That was actually where I'd just gotten rereading this morning, I think, was the section about digression.
Sorry, I've just gone a bit silent because I was just trying to get a sense of what the massive sort of parastratic discussions were in the sidebar. So here, let me just, I'm trying to get, I think, to a point where people feel that there's some relatively confident steps. So I'm being drawn back to this, to this epic translation protocol that Amy's provided us with. So because we're going to be confident that we've interlocked with it, if we're confident that we've identified in relation to QWERTY a stratum of content and a stratum of expression, and let me just try and sort of hold a few things together that we've been talking about, because this cybernetics, the cybernetics point, I think, is this, that content and expression together compose a stratic system. They are like, the reason that Deleuze and Guattari, for instance, talk about perception and action, or I can't remember actually their exact vocabulary, maybe motility and perception in the animal, which is obviously, in a sense, the classic cybernetic couple, that it's a system that stabilizes the perceptions on the perceptual system of the animal and the motor system of the animal are stratic in Deleuze and Guattari senses, in that you can't reduce one to the other. There isn't a dominant formalism on one side from which you can derive the formalism on the other side. There's a twin formalism in that the distinction between the motor system and the perceptual system is a real distinction. They're independently organized, but they are held together by their cybernetic interdependency, that your actions will modulate your perceptions in an organized way. Your cognitive perceptual system will modulate your behavior in a certain way, and the two together are cybernetically, have a coherent cognitive perceptual system, and you have a coherent behavioral system, because it's together a functional cybernetic loop. There is a form of capture, obviously. Both sides are captured by this. Your thoughts and perceptions, from straying beyond certain bounds, they're brought back to a certain zone by the fact that tested and processed and adjusted by your actions and your behavior similarly regulated and pushed into forms of invariance by your perceptual and cognitive map of the world. So it's neither of them is collapsible into the other. The two are a kind of coherent system between themselves. And content and expression has to be, I think, like that. You know, it's a dynamic, stabilizing system in which content and expression, however they are manifested in a particular stratum, manifest this predictable cybernetic behavior of reciprocal stabilization, that they capture each other within this loop, or the loop captures them both, because they can't stray from it. If one direction, they're brought back by the other, and reciprocally. So I think that this is something that that has to apply in the QWERTY case, that there can be no independence to the question of capture. How have we been captured by QWERTY, and this question about what its actual stratic structure is, because the way in which we identify these planes of content and expression is going to be the way that we describe its cybernetic structure. And so you have to think, what are the kind of lines of deviance that are being inhibited on both the side of content and the side of expression by their reciprocal participation in a machine of stratification. And then, so this is all supposed to, this is me looping back to this discussion that we've got here in the sidebar about it. Like, if we're formulating this at the sort of a level that captures the whole machine, the whole machine has to encompass the social and technological and economic reproduction of QWERTY. I think that's something that doesn't seem to me a controversial part of this claim. So what to the various kind of processes of deviation that are being suppressed by it, for instance, include migrating into different keyboard arrangements. If migrating into a different keyboard arrangement is what on one stratum is being prevented, then the reciprocal stratum has to explain deviation isn't machinically plausible, in the same way that maladaptive behavior is acts as a control on thoughts and perceptions. That if an animal's thoughts and perceptions deviate in certain ways that lead to it behavior becoming impractical, non-viable, then those thoughts and perceptions will be kind of restrained and constrained and brought back within this system of capture. And so that's the abstract mechanism that we're involved with in QWERTY-nomics in the same way. We're captured by QWERTY by the fact that there's a particular kind of range of lines of deviation that are being systematically constrained. Let me just try. It's just I can tell this is not very helpful.
This is like maybe a preliminary way of thinking through that reciprocality, but and very simple. But maybe in the first articulation, you have the alphabet. That's your statistical selection. Then your form of content is the limitations of the human hands. And then the expression is coded by the form of originally the digraph problem, and that being the original problem that made QWERTY a possible solution. And then the content of expression is QWERTY. So you have a feedback between the limitation that's or the amalgamation of the alphabet and the human hand is something that has to be expressed in the double articulation, and that they don't fall back into, like, I don't know, because the digraph problem sort of wasn't salient for very long, but you don't get Dvorak and you don't get these other things because QWERTY kind of gets there and solves the digraph problem before the other formulations take hold. So the reciprocality between the two articulations is this kind of limitation of the digraph problem connecting to the kind of a human hand alphabet pair. I mean, that's just a really basic way of thinking that through, but just to sort of practice understanding the cybernetic relationship you're talking about. I'll put it in here.
Yeah.
In the Delander piece that I posted a little bit earlier on, he kind of contrasts stratification with meshworks, and he talks about it in terms of cybernetics. And I think what he's kind of saying is that stratification is it's a reciprocal relation which enforces a kind of set of stable states, which I guess you could understand as negative feedback. And then the meshwork is a cybernetic relationship which reinforces the possibility of lines of flight. So you get like this kind of mutually reinforcing ability to bring in new nodes and kind of consolidate drift. And so he sees that, I suppose, as a mutually reinforcing autocatalytic type of cybernetic diagram. I don't know if that's kind of helpful, but
no, it's helpful, but it's helpful because it points us also to one complicating factor, because as you say, the model of capturing cybernetics is normally negative feedback. It's so straightforward. Like deviation is cancelled out, brought back. It was zoned on some zone. Sorry, some it's homed onto some zone, like an ideal temperature or whatever the system is controlling. What's weird and I think complicating about what we're dealing with now is that the lock-in mode of capture based upon positive feedback, like network effects are a positive feedback effect. You know, the more people use QWERTY, the more useful QWERTY becomes. So the more people use it, that it's a cumulative positive feedback process that actually locks in QWERTY. But I think it has to be that there is some higher level structure based on positive feedback in which that is encompassed. Like I think that the positive feedback element is what they're calling relative deterritorialization, and the complementary reterritorialization is the closure of a larger scale homeostatic circuit that can absorb that process of amplification without it just escaping. So I mean, I think that this is the sort of part of the translation task that we have for this. If we're trying to convert the theoretical models of these papers we were looking at in the first few weeks now into this model of stratification, I think that sort of the translation protocol between them involves this question. So all of the sorry, I think I should not try to talk and think at the same time. I'll try and find an excuse to sort of take a moment.
I was just going to ask, I'm not sure how much it's just very striking to me that with QWERTY and a lot of these platform things, that as if we take it as a sort of a platform, then platforms they're both the protocol, they lock down certain things very strictly, and then they don't care at all, or they're enablers for generativity in many other dimensions, right? And that seems relevant to me, because that's where the positive network effect comes from. It's because it's such a generative system. That's where the momentum,
why it's plastic
in the positive network effect aspect comes from. It seems to me that without that generativity, you don't get that lock-in to the same extent. It's like, this is what I'm using to achieve all these things, and
yes, that's really helpful.
It sort of pushes pressure on the protocol, which is the constraint.
Yes, because they say here, the question we must ask is what on a given stratum varies and what does not, for the unity and diversity of a stratum. So I think that's exactly where your point is here, isn't it? That there's a systematic distinction between the variable and constant elements of the stratum. So on one level, you look at the QWERTY keyboard, and there's all this stuff that is just rigidly locked down. It just wouldn't be a QWERTY keyboard if those things didn't hold. But I think you're totally right. So it's a mistake to just fixate entirely on that. Those standard features slaps for this process also a variation and plasticity, and allow, as you say, for its kind of massive. So yeah, I think that's really an important part of it for sure. Yes, I think that's sort of very, very helpful. I mean, that's also back to this question about, yes, how is the process of runaway amplification of the system still stratic. And it's stratic because of this structure, isn't it? Because of the fact that there is a system of invariance that is the definition of the platform, or part of the definition of the platform, that is continuous, irrespective of its spread and expansion into all of these.
Right, and also like, yeah, it's exactly the variation that it allows that promotes the lock-in, or that promotes the reinforces the structure, right? So the keyboard doesn't care whether you're, you know, typing, you know, poetry or making Facebook updates or whatever, right? It doesn't care whether you're writing a novel or
Yes.
a shopping list, right? There's absolutely no, it doesn't matter about that variation, except in certain subtle ways that we sort of talked about, but that it's all within the context of massive generativity. Okay, struggling to map it beyond that, but that seems critical.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it seems like if we go back to these earlier pieces, as we try and nail down what is this machine of capture, and obviously the one controlling factor that is emphasized a lot in the David piece, very plausibly I would have thought, in culture, isn't it? That obviously acts as a controlling factor in this system. That you have this mass of typists who've learned QWERTY and familiarized themselves with QWERTY, and to retrain them all, or to try to sell a kind of different layout of a keyboard or whatever, to their acquired typing culture is gonna fail. The manufacturing side and the technological design innovation side is controlled by the typing culture serves as the controlling node on that, it seems they're suggesting. Like when they say, sorry, it's a whilst I'm just trying to remember what their exact language was for this thing about irreversible investment. How did they say it again? Yes. So their lock-in features, David's lock-in features is, again, technical interrelatedness, economies of scale, and quasi-irreversibility of investment. And that quasi-irreversibility investment is this typing culture. So that has to be, that acts as a constraint or a control on it in one way. I mean, it's strangely ambivalent, because on the other side, as you say, the uses that it will be put to, in variations. If you've got this kind of wave of expansion of this format, a new unit user, it's constantly, again, sorry, I'm switching. To learn some QWERTY language, it's always going to be a deterritorialization. Like you're moving beyond a particular user base into a bigger user base and a bigger user base, and so you're entering into these different territories just by the fact that it's and it's growing. But on the other hand, this fixed base of acquired QWERTY format typing skills means that there are a whole bunch of invariant features that are not up for practical negotiation in that process of transformation. I mean, it's kind of weird, like if you think, for instance, sorry, I'm now going to this hyper-concrete level, but it might be too concrete to be helpful, but you think of a keyboard that is used for PC gaming by someone. So they're not typing this at all, and they're just simply using the keys as instructions to play a game. So there's a certain sort of, you know, deterritorialization and decoding of the keyboard that just happens with that it's like it's moved into a new territory, it's recoded. This key no longer means you produce the letter K, but it means kill, 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 or some other thing in this game. But even there, it's going to be it's going to be re-territorial. The gamer too is going to this gaming culture is also going to acquire this set of habits and familiar things with the keyboard that say, you know, I expect the button that moves me sideways is going to be here. And you know what I'm saying, that even if the whole usage has been totally transformed, open to a whole habituation that is perhaps totally independent of the habituation of typing skills that the QWERTY typist has learned.
Right. I mean, we might want to limit the tangent, but there's two things this reminds me of, actually. So one is that there's this whole massively trivial and massively passionate debate among gamers, which I'm not totally in the middle of the culture of, but close enough to, about the whole PC master race versus console type thing. And that the relevant to what we're talking about is that on the console you use a controller, not a keyboard. Use this sort of dedicated, you know, device, and there's various sort of attempts to sort of I don't know, like competitions where PC gamers, you know, try to kill in games the console gamers or whatever, and tend to be more effective, right? Using the keyboard, even though it's remapped to a movement thing in combination with the mouse. That I'm maybe not sure where to connect that exactly. But the other one is you have this very passionate set of subcultures starting to die away really only now among programmers with editors. So the old text editors to Unix, so Emacs and VI, this was a massively passionate area of debate, and there were and so people would become locked in to very specific keyboard patterns because they came from a period where you didn't use a mouse, a lot of it. So you sort of so these very almost like quite arbitrary keyboard patterns about I for insert and, you know, :Q for quit or whatever, people become extremely attached to in exactly the same way. You know, yeah, we're losing some abstraction, but I mean, the continuity of the protocol, you know, having been reading the Bratton book, he talks about the Theseus paradox about 4 or 5 times of like ship being rebuilt, and is it the same ship? Right?
Yeah.
So you replace all the wood in the ship, but it's the same shape, so it's still Theseus's ship. I mean, that's exactly the case with the keyboard as well. And then you have this massively changing nature of work, where it's instead of like dictation being pushed to a female-dominated typing pool, you have much more self-directed writing and composition at the keyboard. Yeah, all right. I'm drifting a bit too much away now to do.
No, but this is back to this thing about that you can't tell the difference between digression and non-digression. I mean, because those sort of relationships are obviously totally crucial. That little machine of the linguistic dictation typist machine is obviously crucial to this story. And if there was an explicit discussion of it in 1,000 Plateaus, I'm 100% sure that would be highlighted as being something that, at least as an episode, was really crucial for sure. And I mean, what I'm sort of trying to do is trying to find these reciprocal dyads of mutual control in this. Like you can see obviously in that case that there's a kind of straightforward, sociologically immediately familiar process of control where the typist's behavior is controlled by the voice of dictation. But you would also expect that there is going to be some, for it to be a kind of stable cybernetic loop, that there is some reciprocal, perhaps more subtle form of control that is operating the other way. If only, I mean, to start with simply things like the speed of dictation speed is going to have as it's going to be restrained by typing speed, for instance. Or I don't know, I'd be surprised if there wasn't something more interesting than that we could find. But yes, but because we're talking about these mobile relationships of this whole parastrata language, I think is about that, isn't it? It's about these processes of abutments and adjacencies and contiguity between these different systems, and that is one critically important and then has just massively drifted apart. And I don't know how much dictation happens now, but I would have thought it's just minute, and as simply something that's just come apart. And these legacy systems from that, as you say, have just been well, from their discussion, you would expect it to be coding, that the coding system was tied up with the relationship of those strata and parastrata. And now, as that's rearranged, there's a decoding that happens across it, where they now have entered into this alternative, I think, much more relations involving direct communication with a computer and software rather than with these kind of inherited social relations. I mean, your Unix example would be that, wouldn't it? Where
yeah.
there's a sort of
Yeah, I'm trying to look. The other thing that I was reminded of was that a sort of poetry musical performance about a week ago, actually. And then one of the bits of this performance, okay, you had, you know, parts of it which are musical, and then parts of it which are poetry. And there was part of it where there was a typewriter on the stage, and they were typing. There was a person typing while the music was playing. Basically, the typewriter is a musical instrument. And I was just trying to think about the reversibility, right? Because sort of when you play a musical instrument, you're playing off like sheet music or something like that, or you've memorized it, and it's sort of like the the coded sheet music is playing you as a write through, and then it's expressed through the instrument. And we almost never think of, we don't tend to think of that at all as the way that keyboards work nowadays. But actually that's almost, that's very much the way that dictation works. And then it reverses, or you can reverse it with these sort of compositional type things, and also more subtle things. I think I have to chew on some of this.
Yes. I think the relationship between the typewriter as a musical instrument was a prompt to this relationship of composition, or are you?
No, it's more of a prompt. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
For some reason, I'm just still kind of hung up, or just want to have at least like one last confirmation about the distinction between epistrata and peristrata. So just like moving back to your point about the use of keys for gaming, like it's usually like, AWDX for different directions, and sort of comparing that to the numeric keypad. Are those specific examples of peristrata, that like drifting and fragmentation, the surplus value of this sort of two-dimensional grid code that allows it to be used in different overcoded ways? Whereas
sorry, Jay. I'll shut up in a minute and let you get back to this. But I think it's a really excellent example of the peristrata immediately, and then maybe in a more complicated way. The immediate way is that by being brought into adjacency with the game, then these keys are obviously then subject to this process of decoding and recoding into movement keys. So I think your question about the relationship between that and the arrow keys on the same keyboard is more complicated and is slightly perhaps more arcane.
Yeah, the arrow keys, the numeric keypad is things that are built in that way, but still like sort of segmented and fragmented, but are not just like through this sheer like adjacency prompting a loop that drives these keys being used in this new way, just sheerly through functional adjacency. Yeah.
I mean, the process obviously of decoding of the AWDX is much more dramatic, isn't it? Because there's no sense of them being vectors according to the actual the code, the legacy code that is then carried forward into QWERTY at all.
Right. There's just like no meaning to the idea when the typewriter is invented and QWERTY is invented for the typewriter, that's in no way held within that, is that those keys would be used for movement in a game. Like that just doesn't exist in relation to it until after the fact.
Yeah. And I think that's So that's it. Their example of parastrata, which is also, I think, locks onto their very famous wasp and orchid example, where you have these completely these functional transmutations that occur by something being brought into proximity, and this process of reciprocal decoding and recoding happening. So, you know, a flower, until it is brought into relationship with the wasp, there's a functional logic to the parts of a flower tied up with, you know, its role in the reproduction of the plant or whatever. Maybe my biology is actually shit like this, and the whole thing is too original for that. But anyway, I'll try running with this and be prepared to be shot down. That there are these botanical structures that, when they're brought into relationship with the wasp in this aparallel evolution, then take on these things, like just like the X key becomes down, you know, part of the flower enters into this functional relationship with the sexual programming of the wasp, that's completely alien to its botanical origin, and it's just a kind of decoding and recoding that comes out of this relationship of adjacency or I'm trying to think, there's a whole vocabulary that goes along with that, and I think it's really similar that at the abstract level with what you're saying.
It's interesting. It reminds me of Simondon in one of the, I guess, maybe like more recently translated into English things of his, like on the technical persona, constitution of the technical object. Maybe he kind of uses this sort of same structure to describe. It's like, it was like a kind of dynamo that involved mixing oil and water, and within like a certain range of boundary conditions, which he calls like the schema of concretization. Oil and water, which have this just sort of like this exact relatively independent, aparallel, free relationship of different possible relations to each other, are able to achieve this sort of technical interlock as a purely after the fact thing when they encounter this set of boundary conditions in which this particular configuration of their relationship is concretized. And if that is, like, as sort of Simondon claims, is the general model for the formation of technical objects or technical operations, like using their material components, and that seems to apply to the wasp and the orchid as this sort of joint technology for perpetuating each one of them. That, and then, you know, further with like these parastrata on the QWERTY keyboard, where a particular domain of action, like a game, comes in contact with this other structure, technicalizes it, or produces a new set of techniques or grid of techniques, which is to say a technology in the sort of classic sense of laying as like a laying out before you, apokestai. I mean, do we think that, like, does that make the parastratic a sort of fundamental model for technics or for the formation of, is that, I don't know, and since that's sort of the alloplastic or one half of the alloplastic double articulation, that sort of regime of stratification.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's this language of parastrata and epistrata, which is challenging, but it's pitched at the level of maximum generality, isn't it? So all the strata, from the physico-chemical, organic, through the alloplastic, all are approachable in terms of this language. So I'm assuming that therefore it cut, however the relationship goes, the parastratic can't, from their point of view, be delimited to the technical or technological, but it could be inversely that the technical or technological has a necessary relationship to what they call the parastratic as a sort of fundamental stratic relationship.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And that's definitely the hard thing about this, that sort of like pitches you into this disoriented, I need a gyroscope because I don't know, was that every time you want to hold onto something as specifically peristratic, it's, well, it could just be strata, and then this thing would be peristratic if I align according to a different, origin point or different cardinal orientation. Makes it hard to sort of lock onto a line and stay on it.
I know there's one claim they make that I find particularly daunting, and I'm sure that it marks a threshold of comprehension when it clicks with this thing where they say the strata as a whole dissolve entirely into the epistrata and peristrata. So, yeah, I mean that's a completely. Which seems to be basically saying everything that you think you've worked out about this is going to just fall apart into speeding cybernetically harmonized gunk, at any moment.
Right. Which I guess sort of demands that we've discussed the peristrata a lot, but then in terms of what the epistrata are, in contrast, maybe in the particular context of QWERTY, it seems like these sort of layers of finger movements versus 2D organization versus phonetics, and then neurological typing, cultural practices, and so forth. That's sort of these. What is he? I think he uses belts. Is the term he uses a lot describing the epistrata. That these are sort of these belts that further flesh out, as you pass through each of the layers, the stratification process that's being formed, as opposed to sort of annexing them as adjacent through peristratification. Does that scan?
So sorry, Jake. I think you might have to just repeat that last sentence again. The one that ends with scan. Does that scan?
Oh, just that. Well, the does that scan was for the entire progression, but just that all of those things that seem, or at least to my mind, can be more intuitively pictured as a series of operational steps or operational layers where signals are passed through sort of layers in a stack, through various manipulators like brain, hands, movements, keys, and so on. Whether that is specifically epistratic in contrast to the sort of mode of machinic adjacency, that the particular mode of coding and recoding, which is specific to the peristrata in the case of these machinically adjacent sort of technical superpositions. Superpositions is also a term that he uses, actually, but I think he uses it in reference to epistrata, which makes sense. Each of these things superimposed over the rest of the stack. But yeah, whether that contrasts effectively with these machinically adjacent elements like game movements and so forth as epistrata versus peristrata.
It's just this question about it's this thing that everyone is doing necessarily, and it's echoing the confusion of the text about this movement back and forth between the concrete and the abstract, isn't it? So you're taking some particular concrete instance, in this case this interest in the hand movement, and then to what extent, how does that relate then to this highly abstracted vocabulary about the epistrata? And I mean, I think it's for me hazy, but that's not to say that it would be hazy after work, because I'm taking it the way they map it partly. The epistrata, for a start, are kind of interstrata, aren't they? That's one of the ways they're trying to think about it. So, the strata dissolve. on the one hand, there's the set of adjacencies that the strata are involved in, and on the other hand, there's the set of kind of refinements or subdivisions between the strata. These are you complicate them in a sense vertically on one side, to use a really crude sort of mental tool. And they say that the relationship between strata and parastrata is to do with coding and decoding, and that the relationship of strata and epistrata is to do with territorialization, deterritorialization, I think, which would be an attachment to your question.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The hands, wouldn't it? Like, obviously, that is the relation that the hands have to the keyboard. It's part of a long sort of phylogenetic deterritorialization of the hand from something for clinging onto branches as an arboreal primate,
right,
to being radically deterritorialized in the technological stratum to a key tapping apparatus, but then reterritorialized by the standardization of QWERTY into these particular patterns, and onto the actual protocol of key distribution and typing habits and typing skills, and as you say, then typing speed and all of that motor invariance.
Deterritorialized into need these keys like represent the letters that are written on them, or is their spatial configuration enough by itself, which is reterritorialized as these various other uses for the keyboard. Yeah.
So I'll just hop out and say my question in the sidebar really quick. It's sort of a step away from this conversation, though. I'm still interested in the role that locality is playing in the character of Professor Challenger that you were sort of posing at the beginning. I don't really have anything to add to that, but that's become very interesting to me.
Yes, I think it's really interesting because I think, as I say, just now, this is just pure repetition on my part. I think that, it is a story. So, we're all, I think I can speak for everyone, being drawn naturally into this thing of treating it as philosophy. And as this discussion goes on, you find yourself more and more treating it as a theoretical text. But it is a story. And it is, and the story is structured by Professor Challenger's voyage in place through the strata, or diagonally through the strata to this threshold of absolute deterritorialization that we reach at the end of the thing. And I'm personally, but I realize deeply problematically, utterly convinced that Professor Challenger is migrating across the keyboard in a way that I do not begin to confidently grasp. But, I just have this really, really strong sense that that is what's going on that narrative level, and we could ultimately draw that line, and that line would then illustrate the philosophical discussion concretely. But I'm extremely reluctant at this point to even begin to get a definite on this. Although, let me, sorry, I'll immediately go back on what I've just promised and just try something kind of mad, which is that if what is the plane of consistency? So the plane of consistency is where there's no stratic distinction between signs and particles. The plane of consistency is inhabited only by intensities. It's this space where anything whatsoever finds itself in machinic interconnection with everything else without segmentarity or qualitative distinction. And it seems to me that you know, if you're looking at the keyboard, well, what is the image of that? It's got to be an inadequate image, obviously, but it surely has to be the space bar. You know, the space. I mean, that is the, you know, everything is consistent as just pure distribution in space. All the elements, of whatever kind, their plane of consistency is at least, it finds its image in just pure spatial distribution. So, and just a kind of a sequence of any signs or particles whatsoever, just fragments of type distributed in space by the spacebar, gets us into this zone of just radical decoding. So I would be amazed if Professor Challenger ends up anywhere other than the spacebar. I mean, I sort of get this. Sorry, there's a quote that I wanted to just add about this, where they say, sorry, one second. Yeah, on page 61, they have this passage where they say, oh shit, is it page 61? Where have I got that? Oh yeah, here we go. Maps should be made of these things. Logical and technological maps one can lay out on the plane of consistency. This is an extremely like graphic and sort of cartographic, obviously, mark of the ambition, isn't it? And one that is just, in terms of this dodgy side of the Qwernomic enterprise, absolutely irresistible. This whole thing that it should be a map of these three basic stratas laid out on the plane of consistency. So yeah, I probably shouldn't go any further down this path right at the moment. But just to say, I think it's a really good question. Yes. So what about this 10,000 BC thing?
I had a couple of thoughts on it. I don't want to go into the dodgy side of this whole thing too quickly either, but the first thing that I noticed was I read the Arthur Conan Doyle story, When the World Screamed, this morning.
Right.
And this relates really obliquely. But the first thing that is kind of noted by his interlocutor, Mr. Peerless Jones, is that Challenger never dates his letters. And he's kind of annoyed by the fact that he sends an undated letter to him. And I like this kind of idea of the date.
Really interesting, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's already a kind of territorialization. And so maybe, I don't know, that goes like clicks very obliquely into this possibility that there's a kind of blank space before 10,000 BC, which then marks some kind of moment of radical territorialization. That's
Yes.
just a
I
thought.
mean, there's a bunch of sort of preliminary questions I've got about this, because one of them is this thing about, you know, is there a code to the dating system in Thousand Plateaus in general? You know, like, obviously that on the most naive level, each date has a kind of meaning in that text, and usually they do. This is kind of an exception of being so. There's normally a kind of superficial pretext for any of the dates given. But is it that, if it's the case that all of the dates actually have some occult semiotic function, just is camouflaged by its kind of superficial historical relevance, then obviously what you would do with 10,000 BCE, that semiotic system, and not something that you would uncover purely through its internal reference to that essay. You know, so that's just a kind of caution, you know what I mean? A caution on that. I mean, I would expect redundancy, and but the others clearly, they have a local pretext. What more general function that they might play. So this one, you'd expect it would be the same, and you could sort of discover what it means internally. But I would remain suspicious that there was something uncover about it.
So this is the only plateau in the book that that doesn't have a particular event that's referenced by the date. Or an uncoverable event.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously what makes it stick out so much, and why it's not even remotely camouflaged, is that it starts off talking about geology, and this is a date that's so bizarrely historical and recent that you know what I mean? If it was like 250 million BC, then you would think, okay, you know, or something. They could lock it onto some geologically significant date, but that's just obviously not what's happening. So it does make it stick out very dramatically like that. Yeah, but actually, I have to actually. I'm sure the Conan Doyle reference has to be telling us all kinds of things that I'm not taking it seriously enough.
Well, one way of thinking about it would be that you only have a kind of historically consistent dating system from that date that's marked at that plateau. If you're reading it through this kind of idea that Challenger somehow is this pre-date entity, and the dating system is
right. The most distant historical date.
Yeah, in the book, yeah. And Challenger is a kind of,
is in the book, yeah. Yeah.
He marks a kind of space where a dating system, the specific one that we have, is reimposed onto history.
Right. Overlaid onto history.
Yeah. I wanted to ask what you kind of thought of this strange line in that framing narrative in the middle, where he talks about he wants to make a computer program.
Oh yeah, that's really good. So for pure computers, a something for pure computers, isn't it?
Yeah. Challenger, moreover, had changed since the beginning of his talk. His voice had become hoarser, broken occasionally by an apish cough. His dream was not so much to give a lecture to humans as to provide a program for pure computers.
Right.
Or else, he was dreaming of an axiomatic. For axiomatics deal essentially with stratification. Challenger was addressing himself to memory only.
Yeah.
I
A
don't
quick
know
response. No, it's fantastic. It's, I don't know, is that 1 or 2 sentences? But it's totally, totally fantastic, isn't it? And there's lots going on in it. I mean, obviously this one thing, axiomatics deals essentially with stratification. As it's, I'm backing out and onto what seems like firm ground a little bit from the apish cough. But that has a huge amount of content in itself, doesn't it? Because obviously the association that the whole discussion of axiomatics has in capitalism and schizophrenia is the system of axiomatics. So they're making an implicit relationship between stratification in general and pure capitalism, that those two things are somehow being theoretically brought together. And obviously the pure computers thing reinforces that. It reminds me of this, it sort of brings us in a bit just on this level. Like, I know I'm just retreating totally back into crass philosophical mode, but when they start talking about the alloplastic strata, they say there was a peculiar position that itself in relation to the strata. I'm actually not confident I can just grasp it. Yeah, somewhere around, again, the same, around about page, sometime after page 60, let me just see. Sorry, I think I'm probably just slowing everyone down. I think I need to just go and hunt this down. But there is this peculiar position granted to technology because of the fact that it enters into all of these, I guess, parastratic relationships with all the strata. So, you know, I mean, through engineering, through everything that we talk about as the Anthropocene, through the physicochemical strata, through biotechnology with the organic strata, that technology has this strange kind of a extreme parastratic mobility in relation to the other strata that I think must be related to the thing that you've just cited about this particular relationships of pure stratification, computers, and I'm going to say implicitly capitalism, because it's just like that. I think that they just provide that by axiomatics and capitalism for them are the same thing. But if you're going to drag me back to the ape's cough, I don't know. I mean, I take that you see, what is the Challenger story? And it's basically, now let me again see whether people think I'm going into controversial or unpersuasive territory, but it seems to me clearly Challenger starts off as a kind of completely familiar, ordinary lecturer. You know, he's human, all his characteristics are kind of and unquestioned, giving a lecture. His sort of, therefore, the sort of transcendent, quasi-transcendent position of theory is installed. It's a lecture room, all those institutions in place. And he ends up melting onto the body without organs, having passed through the kind of particle clock or whatever, you know, disintegrated, disidentified. And so the intermediate steps, epistrata, they're these thresholds of deterritorialization that take him from this initial position in steps through the strata. I'm going to say problematically down through the strata to the body without organs on this diagonal path. And that's the, as a so I'm just trying to think. I've lost a bit of vocabulary here, but so I'll just ignore it. As a story voyage that he's involved in. So I'm going to take it that all of these other little things about him are clues, are kind of indexes of thresholds of deterritorialization that he is passing through on this voyage.
What is yeah what is a particle clock, or what do they mean by that? Are they talking about this idea of like signs on the body without organs are particle signs or something like that, or is a particle clock an actual thing?
Well, a particle clock, actually, I don't know. I'm losing it in terms of what's come from Lovecraft and what hasn't here. That intersection, I have.
The clock is in Lovecraft. The coffin-shaped clock.
The weird clock, but he doesn't call it a particle clock, though, does he? No. So, I mean, yeah, I endorse all of your reading and also your question. I mean, it clearly is these emission of particle signs, isn't it? Intensive elements that are not divisible between belonging to a physical or semiotic register. Whether there's something more than that, I don't know. I would think so. Obviously, I always tend to think so, but I would think so.
Well, if you take Challenger as an avatar for Lovecraft's Randolph Carter, I mean, the experience that Carter has is the experience of ego death, basically, and he effectuets his return and exit from that.
Right.
Like Challenger, right? They both progress. They both end up with pincers.
Yeah.
They both progressively, in the two stories, they both progressively lose their voice.
Yeah.
And this kind of, I mean, he and Randolph Carter disappears into his clock, which is also a kind of sort of time traveling vessel.
Yes.
That he moves between dimensionalities in.
Yes. Because there's another reference in Thousand Plateaus to Randolph Carter's communion with Yog-Sothoth. I'm trying to remember. I think it's probably in the becoming woman, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible piece. But I'm not saying it with total confidence. But it's definitely very explicit about that exact moment. It's talking about dimensionality and that exactly that same episode is done there too. Yeah, and the time travel thing is utterly crucial, of course. Yeah, because of the fact that it's this thing going right through this about absolute deterritorialization, is imminent. It's not something to become. It's not something that's been built over. So there is that kind of implicit thing about there is always that retrochronic line open, isn't there? So yeah, sorry.
Back before dates. Dateability. This is maybe just a side question, but the example that does Deleuze uses, you know, in other places like what is philosophy of the when he's talking about what's it in. He's like, he kind of uses the example of the light of the cone and kind of cutting into the cone on different planes, and you get completely different planes of immanence out of it. Like Lovecraft uses that image in this story as well, and I was wondering if like Deleuze maybe got it from that, or if it was a kind of just a general way of thinking about, I don't know, moving through different sort of spatio-temporal.
I don't know. It sounds very much like this same, to hunt it down. I don't think it's not the sort of thing that probably be, unless, let me just very, very quickly look whether Lovecraft was to take us to it.
I was also, just while you're looking, thinking that particular line, right, where he talks about he wants to make a program for computers. First thing I thought of reading it in English was like computers as also being, you know, the kind of original word for typists, and how that kind of worked nicely, this program for typists. But then also in French, it's ordinateur, which is actually a biblical term in French. So when I looked up the history of this, when they were figuring out what to name a computer, this guy, what was his name? Jacques Perret, he suggested to like using the word ordinateur, which is a biblical word to refer to like God. So the God who arranges and who orders, assembles things. So you've got this kind of like this idea of making this program for at once like God and for typists. And then I was just kind of thinking, like, I haven't made any like rigorous connections here, but that also that idea that the stratifications are the judgments of God. And then when you kind of said in the first or second lesson, QWERTY is a religion as well, I kind of thought of it in relation to this use of the word ordinateur in that particular sense.
No, it's good, because I have a real a vice here that comes from my an ancient path through this thing which is tied up with the English language, you know, and a lot of the questions that we're dealing with to do with fatality and science and tradition, and I tend, just as an inheritance of this previous this is all in very dodgy zone set of investigations, to really overlook the fact that it obviously is a French book, you know, by taking, it's like the same attitude, actually, I'm trying to be analytical about it, as people have about the King James version of the Bible, you know, like where these nutty Protestant cults, and I say that with the greatest respect because I'm in the same position with this, of just take it that the English King James version of the Bible is somehow the word of God more thoroughly than the Greek and Hebrew, which is just whatever, a kind of a distraction from this actual proper manifestation of the revelation of the scripture, or whatever. And so that sense about Deleuze and Guattari, that it was like, you know, the English is like the King James version of Deleuze and Guattari in exactly the same way. But I realized that that's extremely unsubstantiated. It certainly shouldn't be an axiom, you know. I've tended to sort of lazily use it as an axiom, which I mustn't. So I think your ordinator point is crucial like that. Oh no, I can't. Theodore's just really trolling me now. I can't believe he just said what he just said.
I think that's
that was. Are you kidding me? The King James is the worst. It is such a bad translation. I mean, a lot of that comes from the Vulgate, because the Vulgate was a bad translation in the first place. I mean, it does some interesting things by being a bad translation, which is maybe like part of your point, like the whole Lucifer thing, like just sort of arbitrarily deciding the passages about the devil, we're going to use the term Lucifer, even though that's actually used, like, is the best translation of the term for Christ, Lightbringer. That's a really interesting one where just like a refusal to translate literally turned into, like, you know, a giant mythic thema of the medieval period. I mean, and, you know, up to now, the Luciferian cults and all of that is rediscovered in modernity, which maybe I'm just making your point for you as I ramble on. So, actually,
I don't know. I'm actually traumatized to a point that I can't respond.
Fair enough. I'll leave off then.
So what about that weird line? He was addressing himself to memory.
Yes.
Was like, yeah. I don't know.
No, it's great. I mean, obviously that sort of that I sort of lost the thread of that, but that was the thing, wasn't it? I think it's like you know, it's clear that this kind of this journey of destratification isn't either progressive or regressive. You know what I mean? It's like, it looks like he's simply, because of the fact that we have this kind of particular historical construction of the strata they're constantly trying to attack, it looks as if he's simply regressing back through time. Insofar as he loses his voice and it becomes an ape cough, and these various accretions seem to be shared at certain point as these stratic accomplishments are shredded on the diagonal line of intensity. But it can't be constructed historically in those ways, we know. So
speaking of time, I've completely lost track of it. It's 1:04 right now, just so we all know.
yes. Okay.
I think we can run a little bit longer, but then we have to start prepping for a next class soon too.
Sure. Okay. Well, maybe if there's any kind of wrapping up kind of stuff that people want to do. Let me just say, just as a preliminary, I hope I can be more helpful than this down the line. But in terms of next week, I think, look, I want to sort of start actually looking at what is there on the keyboard, you know, and sort of analyzing what we're seeing when we're seeing the QWERTY keyboard. But I'm reluctant right now to be more specific than that, because I'm going to try to sift it so that we start on stuff that seems relatively non-psychiatric and only get to the more gone material when we're just about to wrap up for you. So I'm going to try and find sort of, it's basically, I think that maybe I can just say provisionally, let's try just talking about the alphabet and QWERTY and what has happened in that transition, just treating them as pieces of code and what that is from one to the other, how you construct QWERTY as a code and how you compare it to the alphabet, and what's going on there, just in terms of, you could almost say cryptography on some level, but as this semiotic object. But there might be just a minute for any other wrapping up remarks people want to make, or suggestions also, if people have things they want to put on the agenda at this point.
I will just quickly say that there's a thread started for the extra day of class. That's in the Google Classroom. If you guys go in and take a look at that, that'd be great.
Okay, cool. Okay, is everyone done? If I disappear into the particle clock, is that cool with everyone?
Super. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
Okay. Have a good
Thank you.
week, everybody.
You too.